Would you cross the Atlantic just for a dress? In the Gilded Age, many heiresses did exactly that, because when it came to fashion, New York might have had the money, but Paris had the magic. Picture Fifth Avenue in the 1890s, marble mansions glittering with wealth, but their wardrobes were filled with gowns that had all been sketched, stitched, and fussed over thousands of miles away in Paris. A woman could have diamonds the size of grapes, but if her gown wasn't from the Rue de la Paix, she might as well have been invisible. Tonight we're stepping into the world where fashion was currency, gowns were battle armor, and being dressed by Paris's great couturiers, names like Worth and Paquin, was as vital as having the right name on your family tree. It was a time when heiresses sailed to Paris, not just for shopping, but for transformation, fittings, gossip, and the intoxicating promise of being seen in the right silk at the right ball. So fluff your imaginary feathers, straighten your corset, and let's wander from the salons of Paris to the ballrooms of Fifth Avenue, exploring the endless gowns, the whispered scandals, and the women who turned fashion into power. And if you really enjoy drifting into these stories of style and society, don't forget to subscribe, tap the like button, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love to know. Let's begin with a simple truth. Gilded Age heiresses did not just wear gowns, they lived in them, they invested in them, they plotted their futures through them. In a world where women had few direct avenues to power, fabric became a kind of battlefield, and Parisian couture was their sharpest weapon. The women of Fifth Avenue understood one thing above all. Money meant nothing if it wasn't visible. You couldn't just be rich, you had to look rich, and that meant clothing. A Vanderbilt ball gown wasn't simply an outfit, it was a press release stitched in satin. A gown announced your status without you having to say a word. It whispered, I belong here. I have the money, the taste, and the connections. Or, if chosen poorly, it screamed, I'm trying too hard and everyone can tell. This was not a world of fast fashion. Each gown was a statement piece, designed, fitted, and worn strategically. You had morning dresses, tea gown, carriage dresses, dinner gown, opera gown, ball gown, each one telegraphing exactly where you fit in society's pecking order. To step into the wrong event in the wrong outfit was social suicide. Think of it like Instagram today. One bad post and you're trending for all the wrong reasons. In the Gilded Age, one bad gown, and you were trending in the gossip columns of the New York Herald. Of course, not just any gown would do. New York had tailors, but the real power came from Paris. By the late 19th century, Paris was the undisputed capital of fashion. If you wanted to be taken seriously on Fifth Avenue, your gowns had to be Parisian. The most coveted label, Charles Frederick Worth. An Englishman by birth, Worth transformed fashion into what we now call haute couture. He was the first designer to put his label inside his gowns, the first to dictate what clients should wear, and the first to treat fashion like fine art. To wear Worth was to announce that you were not just wealthy, but also fashionable in the most elite sense. Worth and other Parisian designers, Paquin, Doucet, Callot, catered eagerly to their American clients. At a price, American women were charged more than Europeans for the same gowns, on the assumption that they could afford it. Strangely, this didn't offend them. On the contrary, it added to the allure. The higher the price, the more exclusive the gown. Dry truth? Gilded Age women were paying for prestige, not fabric. $1,000 gown wasn't about silk and lace. It was about the name stitched into the lining. Many heiresses planned their years around shopping trips to Paris. Every spring and autumn, steamships carried them across the Atlantic, trunks at the ready. Once in Paris, they descended on the salons of Worth, Paquin, or Doucet for fittings. Each visit was a performance. Tea served, live mannequins modeling the latest designs, designers fussing and flattering. Fittings could stretch for days. Sleeves adjusted, hems measured, bodices tightened until breathing was optional. Heiresses endured it all with smiles. After all, suffering for fashion was practically expected. And once the gowns were packed and shipped back to New York, They became the wardrobe arsenal for a season's worth of appearances, Newport balls, Fifth Avenue dinners, and if the heiress was ambitious enough, presentations at European courts. Imagine flying to Milan today just to buy the latest Gucci collection, and then returning 6 months later for the autumn line. That was the rhythm of the Gilded Age fashion calendar. These dresses were not casual purchases. They were investments in reputation, in family standing, in marital prospects. A debutante in a Worth gown was a stock rising fast. A young woman in last year's silhouette was a stock to be quietly sold off. Mothers understood this better than anyone. They poured fortunes into their daughters' wardrobes, calculating that the right gown at the right ball could secure a match worth millions. Think of it as venture capital in velvet. High risk, high reward, and prone to collapse if someone spilled claret down the front bodice. And because competition was fierce, gowns couldn't be repeated too often. A debutante might wear a dress once, maybe twice, before it was relegated to the back of the wardrobe, destined to be dismantled for fabric or passed down to a less important cousin. To grasp the scale of this obsession, consider a single day in the life of a Gilded Age heiress. Morning, a tea gown, loose, flowing, meant for receiving visitors at home. Afternoon, a carriage dress, structured, high-necked, worn for promenades along Fifth Avenue. Late afternoon, a visiting gown, tailored and modest, for paying social calls. Evening, a dinner gown, elegant but not too revealing, meant for intimate gathering. Night, a ball gown, the pièce de résistance, dripping in satin, lace, and jewels, designed to dazzle under candlelight. That's 5 wardrobe changes in a single day. Multiply that by an entire social season, and you begin to see why trunks of gowns traveled constantly between New York, Newport, and Paris. Modern comparison? Imagine changing your outfit 5 times a day just to scroll Instagram, attend Zoom call, and run errands. Except each outfit costs as much as a new car. For these heiresses, gowns were more than clothing. They were theatre. A Vanderbilt daughter in a glittering Worth gown, sweeping into the ballroom of the Astor Mansion, was making a statement as loud as any Broadway production. Every bead, every ribbon, was a cue to the audience. Watch me, envy me, admire me. And the audience did. Newspapers covered gowns as avidly as they covered politics. Fashion sketches were published in society papers. Magazines like Harper's Bazaar and Vogue devoted spreads to the latest Parisian styles, ensuring that even those who couldn't afford couture could at least sigh over the drawings. Fashion was everywhere. It shaped conversations, guided gossip, and provided the backdrop for marriages that determined the future of fortune. It's tempting to dismiss all this as frivolous, feathers, lace, endless fitting, but in truth, fashion was one of the few arenas where women of the Gilded Age wielded real power. They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office. Their economic lives were largely controlled by fathers and husbands. But in the world of gowns, they set the rules. They dictated taste. They forced Paris to adapt to them, and in doing so, they reshaped the global fashion industry. By the late 19th century, Paris had managed what no other city on earth could quite achieve. It had made itself not merely a capital of fashion, but the unquestioned dictator of it. If Rome once dictated laws and London dictated finance, Paris dictated how wide your sleeves should be, what shade of satin your debutante gown ought to shimmer in under candlelight, and precisely how much you needed to overpay to be taken seriously in society. For the Gilded Age heiresses of Fifth Avenue, it was not optional. Paris was the mothership. Every spring, steamships lumbered out of New York Harbor filled with women who had been raised in marble mansions, who already had wardrobes stuffed with silks and velvets, but who nevertheless crossed the Atlantic because nothing in Newport or on Fifth Avenue could compare to a label discreetly stitched into a Parisian bodice. The journey was less holiday than pilgrimage. Their trunks left America half empty and returned bulging, their contents guarded as though they were transporting crown jewels. Paris was not just where one bought a gown, it was where one secured an identity, and at the center of this ritual stood Charles Frederick Worth, the self-appointed Emperor of Couture, an Englishman who had somehow convinced Paris to let him rule its sartorial kingdom. Worth was not merely a dressmaker, he was a prophet. He pioneered live mannequins to model his gowns, introduced the idea of seasonal collections, and perhaps most audaciously, placed his own label inside each garment. This tiny scrap of fabric transformed a dress into an artifact of power. A woman might own a diamond necklace, an opera box, and a summer cottage with 70 rooms, but if her gown did not say Worth, her reputation was instantly dimmed. Worth understood the psychology of his American clients better than anyone. He charged them more than his European customers, not by accident, but by design. The assumption was that they were wealthier, and the delightful irony is that the heiresses seemed to relish this exploitation. To be charged double was not an insult, it was proof of exclusivity. If you were paying through the nose, then surely the gown must be more special. Money, after all, was meaningless unless it was being actively burned in the pursuit of prestige. In that sense, Worth was not merely selling dresses, he was selling reassurance. The reassurance that one's fortune was not only intact, but displayed in exactly the right silhouette. The fittings themselves were marathons of vanity. Heiresses and their mothers endured endless pinning, tugging, and whispered debates about lace trims while sipping tea in gilt-lined salons. They were shown sketches, sometimes entire mini-theatrical presentations, with mannequins striding dramatically through the room as if Parisian satin had the power to stop wars. And perhaps it did, at least the wars of gossip. Sleeves grew puffier by the year, skirts narrowed, then widened, then narrowed again, in a dizzying cycle that kept heiresses on their toes, or rather, in their corsets. Paris learned quickly that American clients loved drama, and so drama they received. Gowns designed not for quiet dinners, but for ballrooms where hundreds of candles burned and every eye needed to notice you across the room. This transatlantic fashion trade was not just about vanity, it was about survival for both sides. After the Franco-Prussian War devastated the European market in the 1870s, it was the dollars of American heiresses that helped keep couture afloat. By 1900, Americans were no longer merely welcome clients. They were indispensable. Designers began tailoring their very aesthetic around these women from New York, who demanded spectacle and rewarded it handsomely. One might almost say that Paris couture became American by proxy, funded by Vanderbilt dowries and Astor allowances. Without them, Worth and Paquin might have remained elegant but provincial. With them, Paris became global. And yet, this relationship was not entirely one-sided. For while Americans imported gowns by the trunkful, they also exported influence. Paris became the finishing school for America's elite daughters, who returned not just with new wardrobe, but with polished manners, fluent French, and a carefully curated sense of European refinement. Alva Vanderbilt, for instance, spent her formative years in Paris, and she carried home not only a taste for couture, but also an obsession with filling her Newport mansion with French furniture, imported piece by piece, until her drawing rooms resembled Versailles on a particularly enthusiastic day. It was not enough to wear Paris, one had to live in Paris. Fifth Avenue parlors were lined with gilded mirrors, Louis XVI chairs, and enough ormolu clocks to make even the French question whether taste had tipped into parody. What is striking is how quickly this symbiosis accelerated. American demand forced Paris to innovate at a speed that tradition alone would never have required. Where once silhouettes had lingered for decades, now they changed almost yearly. Bodices were cut differently, trains lengthened and shortened, sleeves ballooned into leg-of-mutton proportion, then collapsed again. Each season, American heiresses arrived expecting novelty, and Paris, ever obliging, delivered. The heiresses wore these transformations home like trophies. parading them down Fifth Avenue promenades, where society pages recorded every ripple of fabric. It was, in effect, globalization by gown. Of course, beneath all this satin lay a dry truth. The Paris-New York fashion connection was less about beauty than it was about strategy. Heiresses did not simply want to look pretty, they wanted to look powerful. Gowns were investments, statements of intent, weapons in the marriage market. A Worth ball gown was not just fabric, it was a calculated down payment on a potential duke. To dress exquisitely was to declare, without speaking, that one's family deserved to stand at the apex of society. And Paris, eager for dollars, was happy to oblige. Couture houses began depending so heavily on American clients that some seasons it seemed as though the Rue de la Paix was less a French street than an annex of Fifth Avenue. The designers tailored not only to French tastes, but to the grander, louder sensibilities of American women who needed to dazzle in ballrooms big enough to double as train stations. Their gowns had to command attention from across a marble hall, which is no small task when the competition was Caroline Astor's guest list. In this way, American money did more than sustain Paris fashion. It reshaped it into something faster, grander, and more theatrical. It is easy, from the comfortable distance of over a century, to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The endless fittings, the trunks of dresses, the fortunes squandered on lace and feathers. But consider the world these women lived in. They could not vote. They could not run companies. They were rarely allowed to shape politics directly. What they could do, however, was wield clothing like a weapon. Fashion was their stage, their strategy, and in many ways, their shield. Behind every beaded bodice lay the unspoken message, I belong, I am powerful, and you cannot ignore me. Paris provided the tools. America provided the ambition. Together, they created a spectacle that was as much about power as it was about beauty, as much about negotiation as about embroidery. And in that spectacle, the world of fashion as we know it today, global, fast-moving, obsessed with names and labels, was born. While Paris was the epicenter of style, even the most determined heiress could not always afford to pack up her trunks, her mother, and her maid, and make the transatlantic pilgrimage every season. Ships were slow, the journey exhausting, and seasickness is hardly conducive to maintaining one's aura of effortless glamour. The solution, naturally, was to bring Paris to New York, and the city obliged, transforming itself into a glittering outpost of couture, where the latest European fashions could be acquired without having to endure the indignities of a week at sea. Enter Catherine Donovan, an Irish-born, Paris-trained couturière who opened her salon on Madison Avenue around the turn of the century. Donovan was clever enough to realize that the ladies of New York's elite, Mrs. Astor's hallowed 400, as they were called, wanted gowns that looked like they had sailed straight off the Rue de la Paix, but they wanted them without the hassle of passports and French lessons. Donovan supplied precisely that, importing fabrics from Paris, adapting silhouettes from Worth and Paquin, and offering fittings conducted with just enough French flourish to reassure her clients that they were still participating in the sacred rite of couture. Her salon became a haven for those who could not or would not make the Paris trip, and it flourished because she understood the psychology of Gilded Age women. Fashion was not merely about fabric, it was about legitimacy, and legitimacy could be purchased with velvet panels and a properly Parisian hemline. Of course, not every family in New York society could secure an appointment with Donovan or afford the stratospheric price tags of original couture. For those further down the ladder of privilege, there was Ladies' Mile, a stretch of Broadway lined with department stores that practically dripped with silks and feathers. Shops like B. Altman and Co. or Lord & Taylor stocked imported fabrics and, even more importantly, adapted versions of French gowns that looked close enough to the real thing to satisfy those who had neither the budget nor the social clout for Worth original. The logic was clear. If the Vanderbilts and Astors were parading in gowns sewn by Parisian hands, the aspiring upper middle classes could at least purchase watered-down imitation. It was democratization by way of department store, though the irony was that even these budget gowns cost more than most families earned in a year. The line between survival and spectacle grew blurrier by the day. This diffusion of Paris into New York changed the very rhythm of society. It meant that one no longer had to cross the Atlantic to demonstrate refinement. Refinement could be purchased on Madison Avenue, draped in imported lace, and displayed in an opera box at the Metropolitan. And while the real doyens still sniffed that true legitimacy required Parisian fittings, they also recognized that a society could not survive on exclusivity alone. There had to be tiers, levels of access, a ladder of aspiration. Fashion provided that ladder. Those at the top flaunted their worth label. Those climbing the rungs paraded in convincing imitations, and those further below clipped fashion plates from Harper's Bazaar and sighed wistfully over drawings of gowns they would never touch. But beneath this whole glittering structure lay something both sobering and absurd. Fashion was not just about beauty, it was about strategy. Every gown was a chess move, every accessory a signal. In an era where women were barred from politics and business, they played their games in silk instead of smoke-filled rooms. But make no mistake, they were playing just as ruthlessly. Morning gowns, tea gowns, walking gowns, dinner gowns, and ball gowns were not mere categories of clothing. They were instruments of power. To wear the wrong one at the wrong moment was to risk ridicule, but to wear the right one was to send a message sharper than any speech. A morning dress of crisp muslin whispered of fresh innocence. A tea gown of flowing lace suggested cultivated languor. An evening gown dripping in pearls announced that one's family coffers were not merely full, but overflowing. It was a language of fabric, understood instantly by those who mattered, and it allowed women to wield power in a society that pretended they had none. Consider the marriage market, the beating heart of the Gilded Age season. A debutante did not simply attend balls in hopes of dancing. She attended in gowns designed to make potential husbands, or more accurately, their mothers, take note. A Worth ball gown with a dramatic train might secure the attention of a duke whose estate needed rescuing. A daringly modern silhouette from Paquin could mark a girl as fashionable, progressive, worth courting. In this sense, gowns were less outfits than business proposals. Men negotiated railroads, women negotiated silk, and the returns on investment could be staggering. The power of gowns was also reinforced by recognition. To be seen in a Worth creation was to be instantly legible to society. It was the aristocratic equivalent of wearing a Rolex or carrying a Hermes bag. When Consuelo Vanderbilt swept into her wedding in 1895, dressed in ivory lace so fine that even the Queen of England took notice, she was not merely walking down an aisle. She was staging an international spectacle that reinforced the alliance between American money and British title. Fashion was theatre, and the audience stretched from Fifth Avenue to Buckingham Palace. And yet, for all the splendor, the dry truth lurks beneath. Much of this was exhausting, repetitive, and ruinously expensive. Wardrobes had to be replenished constantly, gowns worn once or twice before being cast aside, and the bills rivaled the GDP of small countries. Families invested fortunes into their daughters' clothing with the hope that it would yield profitable marriages. Sometimes it did. Other times, it merely left them with trunks of satin and nothing to show for it. To call it strategic is fair. To call it absurd is also accurate. This was the paradox of fashion in the Gilded Age. On one hand, it offered women a language of power, a way to maneuver in a society that denied them formal authority. On the other, it shackled them to an endless cycle of consumption, comparison, and competition, where identity was stitched not into one's character, but into one's hemline. Still, for many, it was a bargain worth making. Because in a world where a whispered scandal could end a season and a single alliance could secure a dynasty, gowns were the only weapons available, and no heiress could afford to lay hers down. If fashion was theatre, then certain gowns were not merely costume, but headline acts. They did more than clothe their wearers. They wrote themselves into history, stitched in satin and finished with a flourish of pearls. And like all good theatre, they left behind both admiration and ridicule, sometimes in equal measure. Take, for instance, Consuelo Vanderbilt's wedding gown of 1895. She was married off, and that is the correct phrase, for her mother Alva practically herded her down the aisle like a very expensive prize filly, to the Duke of Marlborough in a union that was more international business deal than love story. The gown, made in Europe of ivory lace, was a masterpiece of delicacy and craftsmanship. Vogue devoted nearly an entire issue to describing it, as if lace itself had suddenly become a geopolitical weapon. Guests gasped, newspapers swooned, and Consuelo herself wept quietly, which is never a good sign at your own wedding. The gown was meant to dazzle, and it did, but it also carried the weight of a loveless marriage, a reminder that a dress can be beautiful while the circumstances inside it are miserable. One suspects that Worth and his colleagues might have cared more about the placement of the lace trim than about Consuelo's actual happiness. But then again, in the Gilded Age, personal fulfillment rarely made the guest list. Then there was the notorious infant dress at the Bradley Martin Ball of 1897, worn by Margaret Catherine Royce. The name alone should make you pause. Commissioned at the last possible moment, ordered by telegraph no less, the gown was completed by the House of Worth and shipped within 24 hours. One imagines the seamstresses of Paris cursing under their breath while furiously stitching through the night, muttering that American heiresses could never decide what they wanted until the very last second. The result was a gown so elaborate it gained a nickname of its own, which is a rare honor for a piece of clothing. Displayed today in the Museum of the City of New York, the infant dress remains a testament to both the speed and insanity of couture. To think that it crossed an ocean faster than most people could cross town in a carriage, that alone is worth a raised eyebrow. The Bradley Martin Ball itself was criticized for its extravagance, a masquerade of wealth at a moment when ordinary New Yorkers were struggling. But the dress outlived the disapproval. If nothing else, it proved that in the Gilded Age, even bad timing could not tarnish good satin. And then there were the gowns that became famous, not for what they represented, but for how they pushed the boundaries of taste. At the Devonshire House Ball in London in 1897, guests arrived dressed as historical figures, Elizabeth I brushing elbows with Madame de Pompadour, Cleopatra nodding politely at Charles II. The costumes were outrageous, heavy, and absurdly expensive, designed less to evoke authenticity than to demonstrate that money could turn any ballroom into a costume drama on the scale of a Shakespearean epic. The Duchess of Devonshire herself, dressed as Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, in pearls and velvet so heavy she probably needed assistance standing upright. One imagines the footman whispering, "There she goes again," as they tried to keep the pearls from dragging across the parquet. Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough attended in equally ostentatious costume, because apparently one wedding gown wasn't enough to cement her into history. She needed a Roman cameo as well. For Consuelo, the gowns were beautiful, but they were also armor, disguises for a life that was far less enchanting than the fabric suggested. Behind the pearls and embroidery lay the dry truth. Sometimes the most dazzling gowns were also the most suffocating. What makes these gowns fascinating is not just their craftsmanship, but their ability to become symbols. Consuelo's lace gown symbolized the merger of American money and British title. The infant dress symbolized both the excess and speed of transatlantic couture. The Zenobia costume symbolized, well, possibly a duchess with too much time and too many pearls. But taken together, They remind us that gowns were not just clothing, they were characters in the play of the Gilded Age, silent actors that outlasted the scandals and whispered gossip of their wearers. And isn't it telling that many of these gowns survive today in museums, while the fortunes that paid for them have long since dissolved into history? You can stand before Consuelo's wedding dress in an exhibition, marvel at the delicate lace, and completely ignore the fact that the Vanderbilt fortune has long since been sliced into trust funds and real estate. Fabric, it seems, has outlived finance. That's the irony of couture. The gowns endure, while the gold that paid for them melts away. Even modern culture cannot resist their allure. The Met Gala of 2022 flirted shamelessly with Gilded Age silhouettes, sending celebrities down the red carpet in modern echoes of Worth and Paquin, corsets cinched tight enough to make you gasp in sympathy. HBO's The Gilded Age drapes its characters in reproductions that remind us how much power was stitched into every panel of silk. And in Paris, exhibitions of Worth's gowns still draw crowds, proof that even a century later, we cannot quite look away from the spectacle of satin used as strategy. It is tempting to mock all this, the sleepless seamstresses, the desperate telegrams, the ballrooms turned into costume dramas, but mockery misses the point. For the women who wore them, gowns were both cage and crown, burden and blessing. They carried the weight of family ambition, of transatlantic deals, of marriages negotiated in whispers. The gowns may look frivolous in glass cases today, but in their own moment, they were survival. And perhaps that is the driest truth of all. What we admire now as art was once simply a tool. A silk sleeve was not just a sleeve, it was a declaration. A lace hem was not just lace, it was leverage. The infant dress, for all its absurd name, was less about a baby and more about a future. The wedding gown, for all its romance, was less about love and more about the continuation of dynasties. And the Zenobia costume, pearls and all, was less about Palmyra and more about reminding the world that the Duchess of Devonshire had both money and the stamina to stand around in 40 pounds of velvet. And yet these gowns did not vanish with the turning of the century. They still hang in museums, appear on red carpets, and inspire costume designers. They continue to whisper of a time when heiresses turned fabric into power, when Paris ruled the imagination, and when the right gown could open doors, no fortune alone could force ajar. Which brings us to the enduring legacy of Gilded Age fashion, a legacy still alive every time satin sweeps a red carpet or pearls catch the light at a gala. The strange thing about fashion is that while fortunes evaporate, fabrics endure. The Gilded Age dynasties that bankrolled Worth and Paquin are long gone as social rulers, their names surviving mainly in street signs and real estate brochures. But the gowns still command attention. They sit in museum glass cases like haughty ghosts, silently daring you to guess how much they once cost and how many people they impressed before being folded away forever. Walk into the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the Museum of the City of New York and you'll find them. Ivory lace wedding gowns, velvet opera cloaks, feathered ball gowns. Visitors whisper reverently as though they're standing in front of religious relics. And in a way, they are. These dresses were holy objects of society, imbued with more symbolism than most cathedrals. The lace is delicate, the embroidery intricate, but what really holds our gaze is the absurdity of it all. We know we are looking at fabric, but we also know that the fabric once decided marriages, reputations, and fortune. Try saying that about the clothes currently folded in your dresser drawer. Modern culture hasn't let go of them either. When celebrities strut down the red carpet at the Met Gala, decked out in corsets and trains designed to reference the Gilded Age, the crowd gasps as though someone has reinvented silk. Of course, the difference is that today those corsets are worn for 4 hours, followed by Uber rides home and Instagram posts the next morning. In 1895, you had to live in the corset, eat in it, dance in it, and somehow flirt through the shallow breathing. The fact that women survive this at all feels less like glamour and more like Olympic-level endurance training. Television and film have kept the obsession alive as well. HBO's The Gilded Age drapes its characters in gowns so faithful to Worth's originals that viewers spend more time admiring the sleeves than following the plot. Costume designers know that we crave the spectacle of excess, even if we're secretly relieved not to be laced into it ourselves. Watching Carrie Coon sweep into a ballroom in layers of satin is thrilling because we can enjoy the drama without the blisters. Even modern exhibitions in Paris still draw crowds to stare at Worth's handiwork, as though lace and velvet hold answers to the eternal mysteries of power and beauty. Visitors murmur about the detail, the delicacy, the artistry, forgetting that these were once the battleground uniforms of mothers shoving daughters toward dukes like pawns on a chessboard. It's hard not to smirk when you realize that a garment displayed under perfect museum lighting once absorbed champagne spills and overheated nerves in a Newport ballroom, and yet there is something undeniably captivating about it all. Part of us envies the sheer theatre of the Gilded Age wardrobe. Imagine being dressed for every hour of the day, with gowns chosen, fitted, and laced by attentive maids. Imagine being told, "No, darling, you cannot wear yesterday's silk. This afternoon requires muslin." It sounds exhausting, but also, in a strange way, luxurious. Today we call it decision fatigue, when we have to choose between jeans and yoga pants. In 1890, women had no such problem because someone else decided for them, and the options were all spectacular. You might faint in your corset, but at least you fainted in style. Of course, the dry truth remains. Most of us today would never trade our elastic waistbands for a lace-up bodice, no matter how many pearls came with it. We may admire Gilded Age gowns in museums or on red carpets, but we are secretly grateful for zippers, central heating, and the right to choose sweatpants as evening wear. The heiresses of the 1890s would probably faint again, this time from horror, if they saw us arrive at brunch in hoodies. And yet, they would also recognize something familiar, the same hunger for recognition, the same desire to be seen, the same reliance on clothing as performance. We may not commission Worth anymore, but we still curate our images with the same desperation. Only now, our audience is online. The modern selfie is just a cheaper, stretchier version of the ball gown. So the legacy of Gilded Age fashion is not only in the lace still preserved behind glass, or the velvet still shimmering under museum lights. It is in the way we still treat clothing as currency, still judge each other by appearances, still equate a label with legitimacy. The heiresses strutted into Newport ballroom. We scroll into Instagram feeds. They fainted under chandeliers. We complain about ring light. The tools have changed, but the performance remains the same. And perhaps that's why these gowns still speak to us more than a century later. They remind us that human vanity, for all its absurdities, is oddly durable. Lace frays, silk fades, fortunes dissolve, but the desire to impress never dies. The heiresses of Fifth Avenue would recognize our obsession with designer handbags instantly. They might even laugh at us for thinking we've evolved. And so, as we drift out of the salons of Paris and the ballrooms of Fifth Avenue, we are left with gowns that endure as relics of both extravagance and survival. They whisper of ambition, of performance, of lives lived as theatre, and they remind us, with a kind of sly wink, that while we may live in different fabrics today, we are still very much cut from the same cloth. And that brings us to the end of our walk through the wardrobes of the Gilded Age. What looks to us like lace, satin, and feathers was, for those heiresses, something much heavier. It was identity, ambition, and sometimes the only tool they had to shape their futures. A gown wasn't just a gown. It could be the difference between blending into the wallpaper or being the center of the ballroom, between being overlooked or being remembered. Paris gave them the stage, and Fifth Avenue gave them the audience. Together they built a fashion empire that outlasted their fortune, outlasted their mansions, and in some cases, outlasted their happiness. The gowns remain in museums, the fortunes don't. And maybe that's the funniest, driest truth of all. Fabric survived where dynasties didn't. It's easy to laugh at it now. The trunks stuffed with dresses, the emergency telegraphs for last-minute orders, the poor seamstresses sewing at midnight because an heiress changed her mind. It's easy to think it was all silly vanity, but for these women, it was survival. Clothing was their language, their power, their way of being heard in a society that wasn't very interested in hearing them otherwise. And in some way, we're not so different. They had worth gowns and society columns. We have Instagram outfits and TikTok trends. The audience has changed, the fabrics have changed, but the performance, that part feels very familiar. So as you settle into sleep, remember, sometimes history isn't made in speeches or battles, but in silk hems sweeping across marble floors. And the next time you're tempted to think it's just a dress, remember the Gilded Age heiresses and how much weight they carried in satin. Script written by Clara Finch, because women's stories always deserve a soul.